despise somebody because you think they're nothing, but they're something to their family.
My family spilled more blood in this for this country and received absolutely nothing.
The facade of the American dream.
This is a story of a people who had existed and thrived in their land for thousands and thousands of years before they were kidnapped, tortured, chained, raped, and enslaved. This is the African who was stolen from his motherland and civilization and had everything taken from him: his language, his religion, his culture, his family, his identity.
Looking at the so-called African American experience, there's this state right now where there's great confusion about people. Where do we belong? Who are we? How well are we integrated into the system or culture?
We're not a natural people. We're not a normal people. We're a made people. And we also have an identity problem. We have an identity crisis.
When you begin to use African American, you're starting to imply that you arrived in the U.S. just like any other and every other immigrant group arrived in the U.S., such as Italian American. And we begin to negate historically the fact that black folks were largely brought here as chattel.
Above 40 million people died. So when you talk about 40 million people dying, and that's not counting the people who died in Africa, as well as the people who died subsequently in the United States and in the West Indies.
That a system would set the descendants of a people who were held captive for 400 years up to fail, it's not too far to understand how that could happen.
The enslavement of African people in North America has ever ended, that it has mutated and taken various forms.
When people talk the enslavement of African people in this country, they talk about the trader, the person who went to Africa and brought the Africans over here. They talk about the owners, the people who purchased them once they got here. They said there was a very important third person involved in the whole thing, and they called that person the slave maker. And this person's job was to take people who had traditions, culture, language, and break them down psychologically.
Our history was not taught. Our languages were not taught. Our families were broken up. The culture in this country has done everything in its power to see to it that we remain subservient.
Previous generations, we were enslaved, which is to be in physical bondage. To be in slavery is to have internalized the process and to manage and to govern oneself according to the ethos and the rules of dominant society, or the dominator.
Since those first 20 and some odd indentured servants disembarked from that Dutch man of war in 1619, the predominant American culture and system has done everything to, in its power, to take that from us.
Most people don't support reparations for black people. Number one, they don't know history. They don't understand the depravity of slavery and its impact on the African Americans.
If you erase the past and then you don't have a common vision, then you're left your victim.
Number two, the leadership has been compromised again, and they don't press for reparations.
There were 10,000 families that held 6 million people enslaved in America. And they could not have done so without the cooperation of what we call house niggas.
If you have to put 20 people, let's say, to watch 50 people, that's economically expensive. So what you got to do is break the people down psychologically, that I dominate you, I control you, so that you can have 2 people watch 50 people. Then you can make some money.
Okay, so they've always had house niggas. They've always had those people who enroll in their model, in their economic model, for their benefit.
Because whiteness and the superior place of white people over other people required that there be people below them.
When you come to the U.S., pretty early on, you realize that black is the absolute worst thing to be in the U.S., and you want to put as much distance between yourself and that as possible.
And that's exactly what this country tries to make people believe.
I think the African Americans are the most despised race in America, the most despised group in America. Why? First of all, we are illegal. That's the first thing. You can't put us out of here. Now, you might jail us, but you can't send us anywhere. We're here to stay. 5, 6 generations after slavery, we are here to stay.
Because we were taken as prisoners of war from other parts of Africa and brought and dispersed throughout what we call the diaspora, we're not a natural people. We're not a normal people. We're a made people.
So when you come here and you see people in this land of opportunity, in this land of great wealth, who have lived here for hundreds of years and who live in abject poverty in communities where there's widespread violence and things like that, you think there must be something wrong with them. They're doing this, they're at fault.
If you put a group 100 yards behind and tell them they can't run, and then you blow the whistle and everybody starts running, and then suddenly halfway through the race you say start running. Oh, by the way, you don't have no shoes, not our problem. By the way, you sick, not our problem. And so what you have is accumulative disadvantages that gets passed down generation after generation.
You don't know, you have no idea what the background to that is. You have no idea what the backstory is.
Past always has a bearing on today.
If you just look at how this country was set up, it was built on the backs of slaves.
The country was built on the backs of slave labor.
Our ancestors who were enslaved, were brought there, and we are the descendants of prisoners of war, okay? But we're actually property.
I'm an African that was kidnapped from Africa long before I was born, and I've been in slavery for the last 300-400 years. I've been robbed of every identity.
In order for that project to lead to a prosperous country that could then aspire to empire, they had to have labor to exploit totally. That is, they had to have a slave-holding society.
The ghost of slaves runs through this place. This is not an urban myth. This is a fact. Here you see one of the blocks where chains were hooked into the walls, and on this here apparatus here was a block.
The natural resources of white people are black people.
That's got us starving, hungry. We're losing our house. We're losing our children.
Racism exists. It's big time. They do it in very subtle ways.
Their desire for empire, for finding other people to lord it over and steal from.
We were enslaved, for God's sake. We were stolen and sold out of our mother continent and brought here to work for nothing for hundreds of years. We were treated like the dirt beneath people's feet. Dogs are being treated better than us.
The African who was stolen from their land and brought to the Western world gave their lives for this new land and got very little, if anything, in return. Their story in the United States is one of various levels of repression and control. Though no stage was as blatant as slavery, many say the more subtle forms can be just as destructive. Endurance and strength in the face of chains, incarcerations, and assassinations have become the way for this people to deal with many bitter realities. This is the story of black people in the United States of African descent and their continued struggle for true emancipation more than 400 years after being brought to this land.
Oh, sheep, they know the road. Oh, sheep, they know the road. Young lamb must find the way. I'm taking you back to the 1960s when I was adamant that adults in this world didn't have a bit of common sense and that Africans in the South had spent too long, far too long, in the historic tradition of bowing and bending. So along with my peers, the young people of the Deep South, we rose up.
Between 60 and 61, perhaps 25,000 students had gone to jail, wave after wave after wave, and thousands of youth poured out. 250,000 high school kids boycotted, and elementary school kids boycotted in October. In New York City with Milton Galamerson, in Philadelphia and Detroit, a wave after wave after wave.
Too many black people seem to act as though they believed that the 1960s was about the elimination of black institutions, and I think that's a very wrong interpretation. I think people, from my perspective, always say that the 1960s was about choice. I like sitting on the back of the bus, but I don't want you to tell me that I have to sit back there.
Dr. King did psychological judo on white America. How? For the racists especially. He was able to do psychological judo by using the Bible on the one hand and the Constitution on the other, and he did.
There were discussions within the Pentagon and the military forces and the military intelligence agencies about him and about what they could do to counter his nonviolence, because it was really a game that they didn't understand. They don't understand love and community. They don't understand how things actually change from the heart. And so they were tremendously threatened and didn't know how to come up with an adequate way to do something about him. And of course he had developed many of his ideas and techniques from Mahatma Gandhi, who also threatened the entire British Empire with what he was doing.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
They freeze Dr. King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963, saying that he has a dream for integration. They don't want you to see Dr. King in 1968 and 1967, a year to the day before he died, speaking about ending the war in Vietnam and the militarization and the Poor People's March that he was organizing and the reasons that actually got him killed.
He gave a speech, the speech that got him killed. He said, there comes a time when silence is betrayal. I must speak, because if I do not speak now, I can never ever again speak to angry young black men.
The time has come for America to hear the truth about this tragic war. Now, I've chosen to preach about the war in Vietnam today because I agree with Dante that the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in a period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. There comes a time when silence is betrayal.
Martin Luther King made a speech right before he was assassinated, saying he was coming to Washington to gain reparations.
Probably the strongest speech on reparation in the history of the movement in this country, where he says that America has issued us a bad check, and we've come to collect on that debt.
Of course, that terminated with his termination.
The assassination of Dr. King was implemented also by police and security forces who pulled out. People that normally were surveilling and guarding King were pulled off their jobs that day, inexplicably. So King was left in the open, and when he came out onto the balcony, it was easy to target him up there for these forces that were ready to kill him. And I think that part of the reason that Malcolm was assassinated in the timing was that he had met with Dr. King and they were talking about working together on the poverty issue.
In the 60s, Malcolm and Martin Luther King had different approaches to achieving freedom, justice, and equality, but they both agreed that that was the objective.
Malcolm X wanted to force Americans on human rights. American intellectuals and politicians don't want to go that way.
We accept Malcolm's challenge to raise the struggle in this country from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement.
Why the American government assassinated Brother Malcolm was, as Malcolm took our civil rights issue, made it a human rights issue, and talked about, in order for there to be substantive change, we cannot rely on the civil process, on the American judicial process. We have to take this to the World Court.
Is by internationalizing the problem and putting it at a level where it can be taken into the United Nations, and then all of the other independent nations on this earth can involve themselves in our struggle and support us. And the only way by which this can be done, instead of it being called civil rights in the future, we're going to have to label it a human rights struggle, or the struggle for human rights.
The way he would say the word Negro with such scorn, he would always say the so-called Negro, and the way he said it with such scorn, that he, more than any other single individual, he was the one who helped change that and made, to get rid of that word, Negro.
I think that these murders were meant to kill hope within those communities.
The FBI and the COINTEL program, Army intelligence and what have you, had become so effective in destroying the movement of Mark Clark, Fred Hampton in Chicago.
So within a 10-year period,
a lot of assassinations took place. You had Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, you had George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, Assata Shakur in exile. They assassinated their own president. So this is what happened.
The real leaders were assassinated. We were decapitated as a people.
Well, that's common. Any system will assassinate the leaders, kill the head, and the snake will die. That's the way they feel about it.
At a time when they killed leadership, beginning with Medgar, Martin, Malcolm, they knocked off the leadership. So we don't have those old heads to lean back on.
Even if you ask the average person my age today what was happening 20 years ago or 40 years ago, they really don't know what took place 20 or 40 years ago. And if they don't know what took place 20, 40 years ago, then they don't know what's going on now. And if they don't know what's going on now, then who's determining the future?
When we look at Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, so many who came before us, when they challenged the concept of democracy and the sovereignty of this country to enjoy its democracy while abusing and violating.
You have to make I guess you have to make your pact with God. Only that individual can determine that they're willing to go on around and have to, if they're someone who's a spiritual person, I think there's a certain level of spirituality that has to be part of that process. You could not be a leader without being spiritual. Whatever God, whatever your name of your God is. And that person has to be deeply committed to their own sense of spirituality, their own sense of self, that what they're arguing for is greater than them. And we live in a capitalistic society where everything is very individualistic. No one thinks that anything is greater than them. It's about me. I gotta think about me first. As long as I can get what I need to get, I'll worry about you and everyone else later. But that's the problem with capitalism. And maybe at the heart of it all, capitalism is the problem.
I believe that the Islam religion is the best religion for our people because it creates unity and it gives one dignity and racial confidence and all of these things that are necessary to make a complete human being.
Are you not perhaps afraid of what might happen to you as a result of making these revelations?
Oh, yes. I probably am a dead man already.
We're key, and especially African American Muslims, we're key because we understand the history of the United States from slavery all the way through. And we can't be put in that position again. I think a lot of people are afraid to stand up, to even protest. Because of what they see that can be done as far as incarceration, as far as just being killed. I would say that number one, as a Muslim, we fear Allah, and that's the only one that that's the only thing. We fear Allah. There is nothing. And I think my husband has said it over and over again. He's even written, you can take my life, but you can't take my soul.
the facade of the American dream.
Every single institution in America is racist because America is racist. And it is our job to transform and change that.
Well, the reality is you had school systems that were separate, but by no means equal, because the resources were able to be segregated and directed into particular places and particular schools. So the struggle was that if you begin to mix it up, then it gets harder to feed one group and not feed another.
It's not enough to say the country's racist. It's not enough to say we're suffering through the new slavery. The question is, and then what did you do? Well, I teach.
Simon said, I'll go 1 foot. I say sit down. Okay, stand up. I won. Jump up in there. Simon said, stop. Here to the train. Stop. Simon says,
my middle daughter was in a specialized high school at Brooklyn Tech. She did exceedingly well. She had a 4.0 at Brooklyn College, now it's a 3.9 something, but again, there was a dispute with one of her grades. I love homeschooling, and I think it's something that all parents should look at as an option, especially if you don't have the money to put them in a stellar private school. After all, mothers, we are the first teachers of our children.
Being homeschooled by a mother is fun, but then it's also hard at the same time. Because since I'm her daughter and I live with her, like say if I wouldn't do my math, I would have to stay up and finish it, make sure everything's correct in order for me to move on.
It was definitely more rigorous than the public school system and more demanding, being that, you know, my mother was a teacher, so she expected more of me, and it definitely prepared me.
She actually has other children as well, so we have to focus on them and also myself.
She pushed me to the very limit and expected, you know, essentially the world of me, so that I would be thoroughly prepared for what was to come in my later schooling years.
We do high school words. We're doing SAT words. We're not doing like the baby small words or anything. We're advancing, or we're preparing ourselves for high school and college and so on.
More parents can do this, and they should consider it. Our oldest daughter, when she went to high school, she was the valedictorian. And then our middle son, he was the school president.
They say, how can you homeschool? Because after all, your child is not going to be socialized. And what I find out is that they're more sociable simply because they're not being told you're not bright enough, you're not pretty enough. And because I noticed that in the school environment, children are somewhat intimidated. They're afraid to get up oftentimes and talk. They are hesitant to do a lot of things, whereas homeschoolers would do it because it's the norm for them. No one has told them black means that you're ugly, and all other negative connotations that goes along with their terminology.
If education is the foundation for people to be informed and to improve, what does it mean when only 52% of black males entering high school in the United States will graduate, and in New York and Philadelphia, this number is less than 20%?
It wasn't just simply living in a white community. It wasn't just simply going to school with white children. It wasn't any of that. But it really had to do with an attempt to try to create a playing field that was going to be equal for you as much as it was for them.
I considered myself very educated, you know, but to realize that a lot of what I knew or thought I knew is all a lie. And that just comes from all of the brainwashing from our educational system, how that teaches us
or reinforces us this belief in their superiority. You know, everything is taught from their point of view.
They were asking them black questions. Who was Harriet Tubman? All the kids, they didn't know any of the answers. Only kids raised their hands was the ones from us. They knew all of it. But there's a collective forgetfulness. It's as though they've erased our past.
You look at prior to Brown versus Board of Education. This may be an unpopular thing that I'm going to say, but to me, integration only works when the integratee is allowed to bring in his or her social mores and values and is able to practice them and embrace them the way they were before when they were in community, whatever. All right, that wasn't the case.
I just really had to unlearn so much of what I thought I knew. And I think that for me has been the most difficult thing. And then knowing that majority of my people are still stuck.
Much of the bedrock of our community as a result of integration, you know, the struggle around historically black colleges and universities. Before white schools accepted black folks, those were the places you could go, which was the HBCUs.
We're going to allow you to integrate, but when you come in here, all those black teachers and that black education that you got before, you're not going to get anymore. You're not going to get anymore. You are going to be taught about our heroes, our sheroes. You're going to be taught about our value system. Our value system.
And that's a part of the brainwashing. It's an attempt to really, we get brainwashed and conditioned as the joke is, you know, is that somebody wants to buy ice. And so they bypass the black store and go to the white man's store because the ice is colder.
A person goes to a black doctor. The black doctor does something to mess up. Man, I ain't going to no more black doctors. They go to a white doctor. The white doctor mess up. They go to another white doctor. That one mess up. They go to another one until they find one who does what they want. But the black doctor, the black lawyer, the black insurance company get one chance to mess up. And then I ain't going to no more black doctors because I did this and they did that. That's part of the psychological thing. You know, that as they always say, that white ice is colder than black ice.
So those are the types of things that have been destroyed as a part in the process of integration. Black insurance companies, black banks, places that develop because of a segregated world. And that created some real serious economic strength in the black community. But now has been undermined because you don't need to buy that product, or you don't need to go to that school, or you don't need to shop there.
Hampton Institute, or now Hampton University, Howard, there is still something inherently valuable in being a part of the majority, in sitting in a classroom and sitting in a political science class and looking at an African American political scientist, sitting in a biology class and looking at an African American with a PhD in biology. There's a lot of value to that. That lets you know, again, as what I tell my students with my grandfather, I can do this because there's someone up there who looks like me that has already done it.
You had something like 146 black boarding schools in the South. Now there's like 4. And those black, and unbelievable, and the educational levels were off the charts. You had black teachers that were there. It was the whole village mentality. Takes a village, it was the whole village mentality. So these are my children in this classroom. They're my children for the day. And I'm going to teach them like they were my biological children because they're part of my village. So I'm going to do everything I can to teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, and history. I'm going to do everything I can, all right, because they are the future. They represent the future. That integration thing, it's been a downward spiral ever since.
I said to a young man, he was talking about going to what was it, Virginia University, and I said, well, you need to take a look at Howard or Hampton or those schools. He says, oh, no. He says, I really want to get a good education.
It makes me feel sad, you know, for humanity. It makes me feel disappointed that to know that there are a group of people that exist whose agenda is to oppress people of color.
You then systematically destroy their spirit by saying, no, that's not right. Sit up, fold your hands, don't do this, don't do that. You cannot educate a child of a race that you don't respect.
Clearly, we know statistically, whatever's being given in the classroom is not working, or we wouldn't be ranked, 25th or 27th in science and math to other developed countries in the world.
Let's be clear about this. No one in America is being educated, except for the super rich.
So why would I feed into that educational model? That educational model is obviously not speaking to who I am, where I am, what I'm about.
They weren't designed to instill in us our culture. They were designed to prepare us to assimilate and integrate into mainstream culture.
So we've got to stop this nonsense that if you don't go to college, you don't have a future, okay? I quit school in the 6th grade, okay, because they were driving me crazy.
We end up creating people who think that they're crazy because they're feeling the oppressive condition and nobody is giving any credence whatsoever to the oppressive conditions that they live in.
So I've educated myself, and all you have to do is to follow your own interest and read.
Our idea in America now of doing education is to teach people how to take a standardized test.
Who says college campuses are such a fantastic place for black youth? And then we have black people who have bought into that, and they promote this nonsense about go to college, get a good education, but they don't tell you that over 90% of the graduates in the past 20 years not working in the field that they got degrees in.
You're going to have to step outside of the box and educate yourself, make yourself a critical thinker.
I always like to remember Malcolm X's discussion in his autobiography of his homemade education.
They talk about Malcolm X and Malcolm X and Malcolm X, but people don't understand what Malcolm X, how Malcolm X became Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was functionally illiterate when he went into the jailhouse. And he sat up there and he memorized every word he could memorize from the dictionary. Just memorize it. In other words, he said, I'm not going to allow my mind to waste or my spirit to waste in this space and this time.
They need to educate themselves outside of what the American educational system is giving them. They need to step outside of that box, because that's a dangerous and slippery slope for a young person to be sitting inside of a school in this country to believe that the only knowledge which is really valuable is what's being given to them inside of their classroom. Advise them and their parents as well to be very serious about their education, and not just education in the formal sense. The education that's probably going to cause the most significant change in someone's life will not take place in the classroom. When it's a myth to believe it.
Where does it take place?
It takes place in the home.
One of the things that I find most troubling is a scanning procedure that they have on their children. Daily, they're scanned before they can even begin their academic day.
In addressing the points my wife made regarding the ramifications of scanning, the social as well as health, and I guess in addressing your point about safety, one may argue crime has gone down, including the need to have such measures, and again on a daily basis. I don't think anyone is arguing disregard those scanning devices. But every day is beyond excessive.
This is really demoralizing to the students. One of the issues that they have is that students are arriving late. And I said, well, is it not surprising? After all, when they go through the scanning machine, they're made to feel as though they're unworthy. If you go into an environment where you're supposed to be educated, but yet still you're treated as though you're a prisoner, or something is wrong with you. And another reason, that I find it so troubling is that we're in an environment that right next to the school there's NYU and Polytech. And these are exceptional schools of higher learning. And when the children, prior to coming into the building, they can look right next door. And you will see students playing tennis. And then they have to come in, put their books bags down, have it go through a scanning machine. And they go through the scanning.
Those who are in charge will take care of their own first.
Is this a legacy we want to leave to our children, to make them feel as though they're criminal when they haven't done anything criminal? They're coming into an institution where, quote unquote, they're to better themselves, they're to be educated. But before they can even start their day, they're told, in essence, by this scanning process, you are a criminal. And again, I'm exceedingly upset about it. And I want us to begin to advocate to say that this is something that has to be stopped.
Education, because as the old folks said, and it's still true, and all of us remember that walking out the door for whatever schools we went to, they say, get a good education, because that's the one thing they can't take away from you. Because if I'm educated, if I'm analytical, if I'm able to be creative, then I'm able to figure out ways in which to deconstruct my own oppression and construct my liberation.
I can remember coming home from school and with C's on my report card. And in my family, that was just totally unacceptable. And my mother took me upstairs. We had a small library in the house. My mother took me upstairs where her high school diploma was on the wall. And she said to me, you see that? What does it say? And it said that she had graduated from the Negro school. And she said, do you know what that means? And she, I can say this now since my mother has passed, literally and figuratively beat into me. Do you understand what this means? C's are not acceptable in this household. You have to be an African American in this country. You have to work 3 times as hard and be 4 times as smart to get half as far. And so I came out of that experience figuratively and literally understanding the value of education.
A lot of these schools in minority neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods are being turned into holding tanks. They're being turned into holding tanks. The new corporate-inspired education reform has no room for teaching critical thinking, teaching literature.
We have limited access to useful education. We get what the South African students in Soweto rose up against, Bantu education, which only at best, if we're not pushed out of the schools, prepare us to work in menial jobs in the country.
The whole purpose of the school system was to educate factory workers to be factory workers. And this is the first crime of setting someone up to fail. Because we all know factory workers are not supposed to think, they're not supposed to have critical thinking skills, they're not supposed to be able to analyze.
The link between the educational system, so-called educational system, and the prison system, the criminal punishment system, as we call it, pipeline, the schoolhouse to the jailhouse pipeline, is such that the number of prison beds is calculated on the basis of the number of second graders who cannot read on grade level at the end of the second grade, primarily Black and Latino males. When at that time it would only cost $3,500 to teach that child to read. 16 years from that time,
it would cost them, well, actually it's 11 years, when they're 18, it would cost, it's $35,000 a year to house them in a prison. But then it's somebody's job. It's, it's the prosecutor, it's the lawyer, it's the bondsman, it's the judge, it's the jailer, it's the construction. So the whole prison industry becomes a mechanism, and once they're incarcerated, then they're making backpacks for JanSport, or bras for Victoria's Secret, and of course once they are released, they can't even get those jobs if they went to the manufacturers of JanSport, or they went to so at 17 cents a day.
I was working in Max Security Prison in Massachusetts. And the only way they let me come in there, since I wasn't working for the Department of Correction, but was coming from my little church in Roxbury, Massachusetts, into the prison, volunteer with my beat-up car every week, driving 40 miles out to just go in there and see the men in maximum security. So they let me in to do a Bible study. I'm teaching the Bible study, and I'm watching two of the guys in my group literally with their Bibles upside down, looking to their right and left to see when other folks would turn the page, and they would turn the page too. I didn't embarrass them, but it was obvious to me. They could not even recognize the letters to know whether they were upside down or right side up. So I went to the prison administration and I said, look, it's not going to cost you a dime. My church will buy it. I will come out and teach it. But I want to teach literacy up in here. I want to teach these guys to read, and I want to teach these guys to comprehend. Prison said, if you bring that material in here, it's considered contraband, and you will be barred out of the facility. So I'm sitting there going, so these guys are locked down, they got all this time, and to do something constructive in all that time, like teaching a man to read, is considered something that is dangerous? Which it was. What I did, I bought a box of Bibles. One page at a time in my new Bibles. I had a Xerox page in each of the Bibles from the literacy books I bought. And I taught them to read underground. And I collected every page back, lest a page be hanging around, somebody would figure out what I'm doing, and put them back in the Bible and smuggle them back out of the prison. So I smuggled them both ways. Right? Because I would have clearly been barred out of that facility if they knew that I was teaching these men to read. That's why I say it still comes down to education.
A country that would remove people from their continent of origin, i.e. Africa, and literally work them to death as slaves continuously for over 400 years. And a country that would treat women as though they were not just sex objects of all colors, but less than human, is not a country that would know how to educate anyone.
The Facade of the American Dream.
How the Healing Community Center came into being was a result of my working at Grady Health System. That's a hospital in Atlanta. I would see folks that come in with cancers of their jaw or of their voice box, and the cancers had gotten to such an extent that they really had no treatment options. And there was just very little that we could do other than put in a tracheotomy and airway and try and get them whatever care we could. And seeing that over and over again, month after month and year after year, each time I would say to myself, you know, somebody needs to do something about this. And then one day I just realized that maybe it was supposed to be me. We're now in an 8,000 square feet facility that we provide general medical care, pediatrics, ENT, audiology, and dental program. And all of our services we provide free of charge. How we're able to do that, we partner with academic institutions, with private institutions, and with community organizations and private practitioners and just general folks in the community that want to come out and make a difference. We see primarily hypertension, high blood pressure, diabetes, and oral health issues are our top three. We also see a significant amount of HIV, and all of those we make a concerted effort to address those issues.
That's the information that I wanted to pass on to you. The new date is June 29, 5 to 7 p.m. Thank you for being a volunteer. Bye-bye.
That's a fire right now, I think that's what she was concerned about when we was on the day and she had to work. She was, so I guess what you need.
Is there a difference between African American and Caucasian patients in regards to their health? I think the difference really is based upon socioeconomic status, and that in impoverished areas, which in most places in the United States tend to primarily have African Americans and Latinas, there's a lack of resources, there's a lack of access to medical care. A lot of folks in underserved areas, there really is no access to health care. For example, we are currently at the Healing Community Center doing outreach to bring healthcare out to folks. There are several apartment complexes within the city of Atlanta where folks have lived there all their lives and really have not been more than 5 miles outside of that apartment complex. In order to get to grocery stores, they have to rely on someone from the community that has a car. One apartment complex in particular has now about 92% unemployment. At our previous location, we checked the nearest grocery store was a 20-minute bus ride each way. And if you have a family, you have to get on the bus, and if you have kids, and then try and do all of that, and then get back on the bus, which you've waited for whatever period of time, with all your bags, with your kids, and then try to get home. You're really not going to try to do that very often. You're going to try to look for other options that will allow you to survive. So what we have done is that we have started partnering with the stores that are nearby. We're also looking at creating a system through collaborating with the faith-based organizations that will provide a ride system for folks so that they can actually have access to get those healthy options, as well as provide mobile grocers that will come in with green vegetables and fruits on a truck at certain days at certain locations to give people other options.
then stress of racism, current day racism, causes problems. So I actually think integration may be one of the big issues, because one of the big stressors is working in a historically white institution.
We do have, as white people, a system of privilege. It may be relative privilege.
And there's been several articles about this, about the stress of being middle class in a white institution. And so now you've got this body, you've got this history, and now you've got this body that's under stress. You get illnesses.
Primary things that people brought to our attention was that they needed to have some outlet for stress. You know, when you're faced with not having a lot of opportunities, not having really great aspects for decent jobs, not having really affordable or decent housing, all of that is going to be stressful.
When you hold out the promise for white people that regardless, they still have the potential and opportunity to rise, to be the overseer, to be the boss, that there is nothing structural inherently, seemingly, that keeps them down. They internalize that, and they are willing to live with that.
It takes a serious toll on you psychologically as well as physically. The amount of stress that creates, constant worrying, constant trying to figure out if you're good enough, you know, if it's you that's the problem. Trying to reconcile that daily, for me, it led to physical problems, gastrointestinal, urinary issues that I'm still dealing with to this day. It's a feeling that every day I'm feeling just knots in my stomach. I've had to have surgery on parts of my body that I shouldn't, like, for my age, I should not be dealing with right now. That there was the connection that there are clear effects, or, well, I don't know.
Your psyche or your inner strength being repetitively beaten down as a result of those types of attacks. If you're not someone that is really grounded and know that, I'm someone of value, I'm someone of worth. If you're not that way, if I hadn't been raised by my parents to be an independent thinker and to know that no matter what anybody says, I have value, you're just demolished.
You cannot rise above this virtual barbed wire that encloses you, or the jackboot that is inherently on your throat.
You think, why even try? Why even try? If just because of the way I was born and the way I look, certain things are going to be assumed that I have done those things, or that I have limitations just because of the color of my skin, which, doesn't mean anything.
Everything saying this is institutional racism, this is white supremacy.
And I can understand that, because if you're just beaten down day after day and you never see the light of day,
The CIA, I love to say because CIA has said that the measure of the quality of life of a people you can measure that quality of life by the life expectancy in the country.
Do I think it's more stressful to be an African American? Yes.
Not only do we see that the life expectancy of African American men is 7 to 8 years shorter than the life expectancy of white men. And there's a similar gap, not quite as wide for women. It's more like 5 or 6.
We've gone out and talked to people in our community, asked them what things that they felt were most important to them. And they stated that they were stressed about not having jobs, stressed about not having good educational systems they felt for their kids.
Middle-class black Americans who have babies have more lower birth weight babies than white women without an education. Health of the mother affects the health of the child. No one's going to argue that. That means my son's health was impacted by my health. My health was impacted by my mother's health. My mother's health was impacted by my grandmother, and so forth. That means every generation coming through has an impact on the health of the child. So when you look at our statistics as a black American and you put it in a life chart with countries, we are so low that we are in countries that are second and third world countries.
We have a criminal justice system where a number of African American men are either uninsured or underinsured, and the first time they actually will see a doctor will be within the confines of a prison or a jail. And that's where they will receive their first physical exam, their first dental exam, and probably upon release will be estranged from the healthcare system.
Driving through South Bronx with my family, I'm not sure if we were, I think we actually had gotten lost because my uncle lived in Queens, but it looked like a war zone. It completely devastated landscape, poverty-stricken population, and it was horrific seeing that in a country that you envisage as being this great bastion of wealth and equality, where everyone is more or less on the same plane.
And they moved out of the suburbs, they moved out of the inner cities, and the only ones that were left behind were those that couldn't get out. And meanwhile, the jobs went to the suburbs also. And so you had the people left behind in a community that was devastated. This population has no connection to the economy, and they represent a potential revolutionary source because, and they have to be controlled.
Seeing this incredible contrast between that perception and how the reality of it on the ground would have knocked me for a loop no matter what, I feel, no matter how old I was, particularly since I didn't have that way to put it in context.
Well, there is a disparity in income and wealth between white Americans and African Americans. Wealth is the easiest thing to address. It's not because we didn't try. Certainly it's ironic for people who brought Africans to the United States or to America to work now accuse the descendants of African Americans as being lazy.
If you truly believe that a group of people are inherently inferior, why do you have to constantly harp on it? Inherently means they can't do nothing. You can get every single one of them a degree from a big university, and they can't do nothing because they are inherently inferior. If you really believe that, you don't have to sweat it.
The wealth that was produced in the United States came from two factors. One, the land was stolen from the Native Americans, and two, the labor was stolen from Africans.
They fear our potential, our possibilities. And they have created this image of us that they have scared themselves. They have scared themselves.
Basically, the political system prevented blacks from owning wealth and even owning land and housing in the District of Columbia as recently as the 1950s.
I cannot believe that, considering what we have done to these people, that they're not always plotting to get back at us. I cannot believe that they just want to, kind of live in harmony with us. No. That ain't, because this is the way they think. That's not, no. They want to get back at us.
America had Reconstruction for 1.5 years. Right after the Civil War, they passed a Reconstruction law. Yes, we know everybody's in bad health and we know everybody has no education. So what we're going to do is do things to give them good health, do things to educate them. Pass the law. How long the law was on the book? 1 year. Why? Because it took money. And they didn't want to take the money. The North didn't want to pay for it. The North was sort of like, hey, we're not the ones who had slaves. And the North was also interested in not making the South angry. And the only way to pay for it would have been to take the land from the Southern farmers, sell it off, and use it to do reparations for blacks. So none of that happened when it should have happened, and all of the pain is passed through. So you can look at all the studies and you can see the buried health problems being passed on generation by generation.
In the beginning stages of Section 8, and I don't even remember how long this has been out there, maybe 20 years, Section 8 did not allow the male component to be in the household. So it was for single families, single women raising a household without a man involved. And she could lose her certificate, her voucher, if a male was found in the home.
A male-dominant family was not something that was valued by the dominant culture.
It made it seem as if the government was her man. The government was her provider. And she could take money on the side from the guy, and a lot of women did. They didn't record it, but in terms of actually being recorded that he was the man of the house and he was actually taking care of the family, no, he was non-existent because she wanted to keep that government money coming in there with the subsidized housing.
The culture in this country has done everything in its power to see to it that we remain subservient.
Think about it. We're living here in the District of Columbia. An average one-bedroom apartment now is running $900. 2 bedrooms, $1,500 and up. So that means you got to work. Most people are going to work to try and, take care of themselves to pay that kind of rent. And the mortgages are even higher, and sometimes they're lower, whatever. If you're renting a house, you're going to pay even higher. But if you get a mortgage, then you might pay lower, but then you have all the other amenities associated with it. That means you got to work for a living. Well, think about it. You got these young girls out there who's saying, I don't have a job, okay, but I can make a baby. And when I make the baby, I can put my name on a list for housing. And when I get accepted for the list for housing, then I can get me a 2-bedroom apartment that's worth $2,000, that's worth $1,500 for nothing. They have no incentive to get up off their feet and do anything. They're being paid to sit there and be stupid. They're being paid to sit there and be dependent.
We have accepted mediocrity. We have accepted. It used to be obviously when a young lady would get pregnant, they always used the phrase they would send them down south. I made the point, if a child is 13, 14, 15 getting pregnant, I'm not throwing a baby shower. That ain't a party. But the other thing is we also must confront those young men. I've called them pastors all across the country to say, you're not going to dedicate a child unless you make the effort to sit down and talk with the father and the mother. You're not going to marry somebody unless you deal with the bride and the groom. So why would you dedicate a baby if you haven't done that?
Unfortunately, in too many households, again, you aren't the parent or even the grandparent now. The grandparent may only be 25 or 30 years older than the grandchild. And so there's not enough history there to be passed down. So there's no other frame of reference of understanding.
Because the white power structure was so angry with the civil rights forces. So they destroyed the civil rights movement that we built with drugs and violence.
a lot of violence in our community and the things that we see going on keeps us at a certain level so that we cannot progress at the magnitude that we need to. And therefore, a lot of people can say, look at them. You're looking at people out there any day. You're looking at people out there on the street in their 40s and 50s that are dependent on drugs and alcohol. And then you know 20 and 30 years ago what they were doing and how they were victims, some of them willingly participants in the drug trafficking and how it tore us down.
Most of our kids will not be going into the system. They will be going into the jails and prisons that are in fact enslavement camps in this country. The Rockefeller laws, which are now being taken from the books, but take them from the books if you wish. What about my children, by the hundreds of thousands that are upstate and all around the state in New York? Why haven't they been released? Why haven't they been rehabilitated and reintegrated into the society? Why haven't they not been given reparations for smoking some weed? My God, weed. That's all marijuana is. There's no evidence that it's harmful. It doesn't make sense to sit around the corner smoking it all day. But neither does it make sense for children to be thrown in jail for it. Here in New York, young kids on the way to school, young black males particularly, young brown males particularly, on the way to school, 9 and 10 years old, are thrown up against the wall by cops. Their book bags taken from their shoulders, books tossed out, taken from their shoulders, tossed out. First day. Second day, they do the same. By the third day, the child does what? The child is ready to fight back.
My 2 sons who died from gun violence here in the District of Columbia were not associated with the drug trade. That's not the reason they died. Still, that whole mentality of violence, was perpetrated. And just, it's terrible. After my sons died, I had an opportunity to meet hundreds of mothers whose children who died from gun violence here in the District of Columbia. And I had an opportunity to meet people probably I never would have seen in my life, because they weren't like me. And the stories that they told me about their childhood, how they were molested, how they were in foster care, how some of them married a lot of criminals, and then they brought their criminal activity into their families, and some of them molested their own children. And this is some of the stories that I heard about them being prostitutes and living on the street and being homeless, and the things that they told me. And then they're raising these children in these dysfunctional homes, and some of their children got into the bad behaviors of selling drugs or taking the drugs, and then it ended up in where some of them were either they were the killer or they're the ones to be killed.
The Facade of the American Dream.
I think we are in a desperately difficult period of oppression in communities of color.
See mass black incarceration, which we can date to around the year 1970 as a national policy. Mass black incarceration as the general white reaction and response to our movement of the 60s. It is as if the general response of the white population to black demand for human rights was to say, okay, you guys won't stay in your place, the place we designated for you under Jim Crow. All right, we have a place for you, and that place is prison.
When we talk about mass incarceration, part of the mechanism for feeding the prison system comes from the stop and frisk and then comes from the so-called war on drugs that was initiated by earlier administrations and continues to be carried through from the federal to the state to the city level by the current administrations.
Crime in the African American community can be directly associated with where society has more or less delegated where we should be on the totem pole.
The structural violence which has been perpetrated against African Americans. So if you think about the social inequalities across the board which affect African Americans, and the institutional racism which affects African Americans.
All of a sudden in the 80s, the latter part of the 70s and 80s, they had that big dump of drugs in our illegal drugs, cocaine, heroin, other things that we didn't manufacture that were brought into our community. It's almost like it brought us to a halt.
Dating to about 1970, this exponential growth of the prison population and the growth in the proportion of prison inmates who were black. In the mid-60s, the U.S. prison population was about 70% white. Today, that has been reversed. It's only about 30% white. So we understand that not only has the prison population increased 8 or 9-fold since 1970, but that increase has meant that black folks and brown folks are now the dominant groups in the prison.
And from the 1980s until today, we're still struggling with that. It's not at the same level, but we're still struggling with how that affected our family 2 and 3 generations, the African American community 2 and 3 generations later. They're looking at us. They're not watching them.
The number and the presumption there was to unearth gun trafficking and gun use and gun carrying. There's less than 1% of the people that were stopped and frisked that were ever found to have any firearms on them. So the statistics bear proof that it is, while we are told that this is a public safety issue, nonsense. There's nothing that bears that out.
I think it's definitely systemic because these things are not happening on an individual basis. We've had black professors on this campus being profiled and arrested by the police after they've been working here for years. And we see the same things happening all across the country.
When I first moved here to Atlanta, I would regularly get pulled over by the police. I had an older Nissan, and I lived in a more affluent area, and I would regularly get pulled over. One day I got a ticket because part of my tag was ripped off. I went to court because I was thinking, this makes no sense. They can look it up and tell that my car is registered and that my insurance is in place and all the other things. And the bailiff told me, he said, you know what, you need to go to the police station and talk to them and let them know that you're new in the area, that you now live here.
3 white kids can drive in a car, 4 and 5 of them, no problem. They think it's a happy time. But for us, it's something suspect.
Where you are most likely to be incarcerated are places like Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Idaho, where it appears that the incarceration rates for blacks are highest because the cops have to keep on going back to those same inner city neighborhoods to get the same black people in order to satisfy the demand to lock more black people up in jail.
I was a little bit younger. I used to be stopped all the time in the airport. And so I would plan on just an extra half an hour because I knew I was going to get a pat-down search. That was before they put everything in place. Now I always make sure that I carry my medical license on me. I usually always make sure that there's a white coat or something in my car that if I'm pulled over by the police or something, which still happens, I can use that information to at least try to open up a window so that I don't have to potentially address some issues that aren't relevant.
Mechanisms of social control are virtually terrorizing and criminalizing our youth in particular.
African Americans in the system of mass incarceration is the most pressing issue of the 21st century, primarily because any African American male born after the year 2001 1 out of 3 can be expected to serve time in a federal or state prison. We've had an explosion of over 400% of women since the 1980s, black women who have been incarcerated, which has disrupted our communities, which has broken up our families, and which has led to the social disorganization of our African American communities across the United States.
50%, and now it's the black 50%, of people in Washington, D.C. are either on parole, on probation, or in prison.
America has the biggest prison population, not only today, but in the history of humankind. You know, in the whole history of man's tenure on this planet. You know. And what does it say about America? It says that something is very wrong. Any nation that locks up and puts human beings in cages for 10, 20, 30 years, you know, and considers it normal, there's something wrong.
We lead the world in terms of the rate of incarceration. Nobody's crying out about how can you, in the land of the free and the home of the brave, have the highest incarceration rate in the world. So we always point out and we look at all these little despotic countries and say, you got to watch out for human rights violations. We got to deal with you because you got human rights violation. And here we go, taking all of these young black men and now rapidly growing women and putting them in jailhouse.
In 1970, there was 300,000 prisoners in the entire United States. You know, and today we got 2.4 million in cages, another 5 million under the control of the criminal justice system, virtually on leashes. We've become an incarceration nation.
The profit behind making money on the backs of incarcerating young black men. We have $1 billion prison for profit industry in the United States, where we have now prisons which are on the stock market. We have the Correctional Corporation of America, we have the Geo Group. So on any given day, you can buy stock in a prison, and based on where we're going right now, you would probably get a pretty good profit.
It gets even more insidious because now prisons are privately run corporations. And in order to make money as a privately run corporation that runs a jailhouse is that you got to make sure that the jailhouse is full. That's how you return the investment to your shareholders.
I think that Louisiana is one of the cheapest places to be in jail, and the average cost is $15,000 to $20,000 a year, whereas each inmate in New York City, I have read, is about $60,000 a year.
If you have a school in the United States, the school would get from about $7,000 to $11,000 per year per student. And if it just says school on the outside. But if you take that same school or build a prison next door to it, or take that same school and erase the word school and put prison on it, now the government would give each student $40,000 a year.
So we're dealing with all of those, and there's and then they meet as associations, all of the for-profit prisons, and they meet with legislators, and they help to design laws to lock up young men and to keep them in jail longer. And so that doesn't come out of a vacuum, that comes out of design. And basically what you're really looking at is a corporate takeover of the country and indeed of the world, which renders everybody back to a condition of being enslaved in one way or another. You're either out there working for a corporation and you think that you're free, but you're really not free, or you're sitting in the jailhouse and you know you're not free.
We prohibited slavery for citizens in the United States, but we've also legitimized involuntary servitude as long as you have been duly convicted of a crime. So even within the Constitution of the U.S., you are a slave as long as you're in the criminal justice system.
We are far from being able to effectuate a change in that. And just to be able to mobilize after you experience that kind of brutality, police murder, to live in a virtual police state. That's what the Black and Latino communities are. It is enormously painful and difficult, and it certainly affects everything about how people live their lives and what they think the potential are and how they are going to arise or rise above.
We have racial profiling all over the country with Aiyana Jones, I believe it was in Detroit, 7-year-old girl shot in the neck by a police officer in her sleep. We have Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, all these different cases occurring all across the country, so it can't be on an individual basis when you see a whole group of people being affected by this oppression and this racism continually. It has to be called systemic.
The reality is in the United States that currently 51% of Americans still say that they have anti-Black sentiments.
The policies are inherently racist. We have never seen in New York City, in Oakland, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, I've never seen in my lifetime a black cop shoot a white kid. I can't name one incident in the history of since I've been alive and since I've been studying criminal justice criminology. I've never seen it. Does that mean if for some reason black cops have more discretion and are more savvy about stopping a white kid and pulling out a gun? I clearly think they probably are, because they would know the repercussions if that happened, right? If Trayvon Martin were a white kid shot by a black civilian, he would have been summarily arrested and probably would have never received bail. That's the reality of the United States.
As a result of the videotaping that I was doing, there was pushback. You know, there's always action, reaction, you know. And there was pushback by NYPD, and they arrested me in retaliation for the videotaping that I was doing. And they charged me with possession of a weapon, a knife that you can buy in any store, hardware store, a 99-cent store, not just in New York, but in the country. You know, with absolutely nothing illegal about it, but they came out of my car with it in their hand like they had discovered plastic explosives on a United Airlines or something, right? And so they, but these were the same police that I had videotaped 2 months prior, and we had a conversation back and forth. They said, "We know who you are," you know. So obviously they had already done some background investigation on me, and the people that they had pulled over and were doing this stop and frisk routine on was two young men. Both of them had cars. They tore their cars apart, frisked them, and all the time they were shining flashlights in my face, trying to obstruct me videotaping this. everything is punishment in America's foreign policy as well as in its domestic policy. You know, everything is punishment. You know, somebody does something to America, we drop atomic bombs on them. You know, we institute regime change. You know, and President Obama has a hit list. He's out there talking about, you know, killing people and dumping them in the ocean. You know, that's the American response, and it's insanity, and it has to change.
I think that we have to fight with the same weapons the U.S. government is fighting with. And no, I do not mean weapons of murder and mass destruction like drones, nuclear bombs, and things like that. But I'm talking about political and organizational weapons.
We have to organize ourselves. We have to become communities instead of neighborhoods. And we have to organize ourselves politically, economically, and socially. We have to become a caring community that looks on every member of our community as someone of value.
We can unite. I believe that if people understand, because I didn't know it, I really thought that, you know, I pledge allegiance every morning. You teach children something from the time they're 5 years old, all the way up until they're, you know, well, through your whole life. You go to a ball game, you reiterate it. And you teach something to a person all their lives, they believe it. I believed I was free. I believed I was valued. I believed that I had rights. And I can't find any government agency that will stand up for my rights.
Americans of every race and region and station who came here because you believe in what this country can be and because you want to help us get there.
We have a situation here in the United States where we have people who have been trained, again, as distinct from education, in places like Harvard and Princeton and Yale, who have taken tremendous strides to further the agenda of the ruling classes. People like Barack Obama, Susan Rice and Condoleezza Rice.
Have you ever saw the lady, Miss Rice, in the UN? Good God Almighty, she sounds like Netanyahu, tell the truth. I said, good God Almighty, that lady is horrible. And Eric Holder, he used to be the U.S. attorney here. He locked up blacks by the hundreds of thousands.
I never imagined as a child that I would see a time when the President of the United States would claim the legal right to kill or imprison American citizens without charge or trial, and more so that person would be a black person.
First, we'd have to define what's a leader. Self-imposed leaders, like Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton, who place themselves and who I would assume that the popular media machine has placed in front of us as our leaders. Is that what you're talking about?
Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, it's too many names. There's just countless numbers of them who claim to be a part of the civil rights movement. And what they do is they block spokespersons. We shouldn't be waiting for Fox News to tell us what's going on.
Until we address alternative forms of media, such as what you're doing today, and providing those alternative forms of media to African Americans so we're not just inundated with images that we see on BET or CNN or MSNBC.
I think we as black Americans are doing wonderful. I think that given the disadvantages that we've had, given the disadvantages that we're currently under, that it's amazing that we are where we are. And it's only through a testament to us as a people that we aren't crawled up in some corner whining.
To go through enslavement and still be a people that absolutely know how to laugh and dance, and you come into a room and folks start playing the dozens with you, don't even really know you, but they start messing with you, and everybody laughs about it. And I said it's because that has been the tools of survival. That we laughed in the face of death, and we danced when folks tried to bound us.
Is there any hope for African American people? Yes, I think there is. I know that there are a lot of people like yourself, Randy, myself, that are not giving up.
Apathy is the greatest sin. That when you're quiet about abuses, then you only facilitate greater abuses.
I think the people have to stand up against the government because the change will not come from the government.
But if you're worried about life, then you need to go and rock in a chair somewhere and get out the way. Especially today. I mean, they got drones. You know, we had to worry about helicopters. They got drones. You know, they don't need to put no informant in the room because it's these cell phones.
We're born into this struggle. You know, I don't have a choice as to whether I'm born in China or India or wherever. I'm born in Harlem. I'm black. You know what I'm saying? I'm poor. And so the battle lines is already drawn out. Right? There's the regulators and the regulated. And I'm part of the regulated. And so for me, there's nothing but war. You know, that's my destiny. And surrender is not an option. So what do? We fight. You know, we fight to change this reality. Because whatever man creates, other men can change. I believe that.
There was a priest, Ernesto Cardinal, and he said, you know, you finally won the revolution, what now? And Cardinal said, well, continue to push. And they said, but you won the revolution. He said, we won the revolution, but it's not the kingdom of God. It's all imperfect. The prophet pushes towards the perfection. Doesn't settle for that, which might be nice, but it still lies on this side of glory. We got to push towards perfection. Till everybody's liberated, till everybody's free, till everybody's included. Till there's no 1% versus the 99%, but we're talking about 100%. That's where we got to push towards and begin to create a new vision, a new paradigm for this country and for the world.